بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless our gathering, to increase our knowledge, to teach us what is beneficial, and to benefit us by what He has taught us. He is the all-knowing, all-wise. Allahumma ameen. طيب, we're starting chapter 1. We're diving straight into the chapter 1. Chapter 1 serves as an introduction. I think it's easy to digest. It's not too difficult of a read. The concept should be pretty straightforward. And then it's going to start getting more advanced as we go on, inshallah ta'ala. Chapter 1, Islam is true. Chapter 1 summary. I'm going to skip the summary. Chapter 1 fact. The statement Islam is true is not a cultural preference but a fact. So the key takeaway here, right, is differentiating between a preference and a fact, right? What is the difference when you hear preference and fact?
The preference will be what's convenient to you.
Yeah, convenient to you, okay.
And then the fact is like whether you like it or not, it's a fact.
Yeah, it's whether you like it or not, it's a fact, yeah. All right, a fact is a universal truth, right? It's not it's objective truth, right? It's not about how I feel. My feelings don't matter. My culture doesn't matter. How I grew up doesn't matter. It's a fact, right? It's a universal truth that cannot be, I guess, differentiated about, right? There isn't an alternative truth to a fact, right? That is a truth. It can be false. A fact is true, right? There's no, maybe it's false for some or true for some and not true for others. It can be. 1 + 1 = 2. You can't be like 1 + 1 = 2 is true in Seattle, but it's not true in LA or something, right? It's a fact. It doesn't matter where you're at, 1,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years from now, 1 + 1 = 2. It's a fact. Preference is subjective, right? So we have objective and subjective. So preference is subjective to culture, personal preferences, what you want, so on and so forth, right? So Islam is true is not a cultural preference. He's saying this is an objective fact. This is an objective fact. So somebody might ask, if it is an objective fact, why doesn't everybody agree on it? Right? If it's like 1 + 1 = 2, everybody agrees 1 + 1 = 2, correct? It's an objective fact. Islam is true is also an objective fact, but why doesn't everybody agree on it? And that could be due to various reasons. It could be due to ego. It could be due to culture. It could be due to personal preferences. They don't want to follow a tradition that limits their lifestyle, right? So a person can reject a fact. How many times have we had rational arguments with people, but we can't seem to convince them because of their pride, ego, stubbornness, so on and so forth? We've all had experiences like that, probably at work, with family, right? It happens, right? You're just like, listen, like what I'm saying makes sense. Like it's really simple. Like what's so hard for you to why is it so hard for you to understand this, right? Because human beings, we're blinded by our emotions. We're blinded by our ego. We're blinded by our desires. And so when facts are brought to us, if we're not humble and sincere and think objectively, then we deny the fact. We deny the truth. Does that make sense? Right? So just because something is a fact, it doesn't mean it is universally accepted by all people. Right? It's important to make that this distinction. And religion is a truth that people have a lot of challenges with. Why? Because it's for one could be ego, not wanting to give up your pride, your lifestyle, your desires. Desires can be another issue. Others you could be tradition, like the mushrikeen of Arabia. What did they say? Right? وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمُ اتَّبِعُوا مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ قَالُوا بَلْ نَتَّبِعُ مَا وَجَدْنَا عَلَيْهِ آبَاءَنَا. When they were told, follow what God has sent down, they would say, we will follow what we found to be the tradition of our forefathers. So they denied truth because why? It went against the norms of their society, or the norms of their ancestors. So they're like, we don't care right or wrong. We're not going to think right or wrong here. Religion is not a matter of right or wrong. Religion is for us, our parents did it this way, we're going to do it this way. And so they're blinded by their love for their ancestors and their tradition, and now therefore that is hindering them from accepting the truth, right? Other people like Fir'aun, Abu Jahl, leaders, it was power. Islam they felt that Islam was a threat to their power. So now they denied it because why? They wanted to remain in control over people. And so on and so forth. People have different reasons for denying the truth, but it happens. And it happens till today. You could be having a rational conversation with somebody, and the person can be completely blind to it, right? It's like, how can you not understand this, right? Like, what I'm saying to you, how can you not listen? Because you're looking at it from your perspective. You're not looking at it from the other person's perspective or from a fair, holistic perspective, right? And so we have to learn. And so this is where Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, he made a dua. Allahumma arini al-haqqa haqqan farzuqni ittiba'ah wa arini al-batila batilan farzuqni ijtinabah or warzuqni ijtinabah. Like, oh Allah, show me truth as truth and grant me the ability to follow it, right? So one is seeing what is a fact as a fact. Truth is a fact, right? Oh Allah, show me fact as fact, one. And second challenge is what? So first you have to process it intellectually, right? You have to see it. You have to understand it. And then second is you have to humble yourself to be like, okay, now, Ya Allah, give me the humility, the sincerity to accept, like, hey, I was wrong, I'm sorry. I didn't know, I wasn't aware, I made a mistake, right? Ya Allah, I repent, right? I take La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? Or with other people. Like, oh, I didn't understand, I assumed I made a mistake, I apologize. That requires humility, to apologize, to acknowledge you made a mistake, to acknowledge you were ignorant. That requires what? Humility. It requires sincerity. It's not about my ego, it's not about my pride, it's about the truth. And as long as this is right and true, then I must humble my ego to adopt the truth, right? And so that is kind of, I guess, a prefix for understanding like truth and preference in Islam, and why people disbelieve, because it's not the truthfulness of Islam, it's because of other issues of pride, tradition, family. I remember like one of my shuyukh, he was a Christian convert to Islam, and when he became Muslim, he told his father, and his father was like, he was surprised. He's like, guys like us, like he's white Christian. He's like, guys like us are Jews, and we're Christian or Jewish. We're not Muslims. He's like, why are you for him, religion was a cultural thing, right? So the father's talking to his son like, we're white people, right? We usually follow Christianity, Judaism, maybe atheism, right? Our people don't follow Islam. Like it's alien. Why would you do that? Right? So the father was seeing religion, if you kind of think about it a bit deeper, right? Where is he coming from? He's seeing religion as a cultural preference, not as an objective truth, as an objective fact, right? And so what we're trying to do here is what? We're trying to analyze Islam as a fact. Is this Islam based on objective truth and reality, or is it just a cultural preference? And we want to make sure that our faith our belief in God should not be just a culture or tradition that we follow, but it should be based on proofs, evidences, and sound reason. Does that make sense? Yeah? Any questions about that? No? All right, so we're going to read. I would actually love if we have volunteer readers to give other people the chance to read. Anybody want to read? I guess the online people want to hear. Okay, I'll read. I don't like hearing myself too much, so I need questions. So please interrupt me. But let me start reading, inshallah, and then we'll maybe you guys can ask questions as we go. Imagine that you have a friend. This book is written by Hamza Karamali and others who might have supported him. And so we want to make dua for the authors. That is the tradition of our scholars, is when they read a book, they make dua for the author. And so may Allah reward the author and on our behalf and preserve him. He says, Jazakallah khair, imagine that you have a friend called Adrian and another friend called John. Adrian is an atheist, John is a Christian. One day during lunch break, you hear them having this conversation. Adrian says, how can you believe that your religion is true? My family is Christian. But ever since I started learning about the theory of evolution, I see so much evidence that science is right and that God doesn't exist. And that's an interesting conclusion. I see science is right, but based on science being right, he makes the conclusion that God doesn't exist, right? So that itself is very flawed, but that's his conclusion. John responds to him, well, if you think about it in terms of evidence, I guess it doesn't make sense. But that's not how you're supposed to think about it. Adrian says, then how am I supposed to think about it? John says, religion is based on faith. Faith isn't supposed to be based on evidence. We're supposed to believe in God and Jesus as our Savior, even though there isn't proof. Why do we believe? Because religion is based on faith and not evidence. So what? Faith and evidence are opposites. You guys see that? Faith and evidence they're not opposites, but you don't need evidence to have faith, is what he's saying. Right? You don't need evidence to have faith. John says, I believe in God just because Adrian says, so you believe in God just because you want to? John says, I believe in God just because I have faith. Even though John is replying confidently, you can clearly see that he is confused by Adrian's questions. These kinds of conversations happen all the time. I've heard it. I don't know, you guys, I'm pretty sure you've seen it even in it's pretty common in Christian faith, right? Like you hear that, like we believe, right? You have to have faith sometimes, right? But no, faith should not just be blind faith, it should be based on evidence. So from John's perspective, faith is enough to make something true. Adrian, on the other hand, thinks that things should have evidence before we believe them. Who is correct? Should we have faith like John, or should we look for evidence like Adrian? Continuing. Faith, facts, and preferences. The conversation illustrates the difference between preferences and facts. Our preferences are our likes or dislikes. They are subjective, right? Subjective to our desires, our whims, our culture, so on and so forth. Which means that they are internal to ourselves and they can vary from person to person. Preferences are not proven, true with evidence. When John believes in God and Christianity on faith rather than on evidence, his belief is a preference. Do you guys see the conclusion there and why he made that conclusion? Does anybody have a question? Let me ask you a question. Why is John's belief a preference and not, why is that a preference?
He has no facts, there's no revelations that proves, he just believes on what he thinks, his cultural background.
He believes because it's his cultural background. He just believes because he wants to believe, right? So is there any fact about that? No, it's just what he wants. I believe because I choose to have faith. I want to have faith. That's it, right? But there isn't evidence that led me to this conclusion. It's a preference. Does that make sense? Facts, on the other hand, are objective. That means they are independently true for everyone. They don't vary from person to person. That's why we can use evidence to demonstrate their truth to someone else. In Adrian's mind, science and the theory of evolution are based on evidence. He also thinks that each of them is evidence that religion is false. Right? I told you that Adrian makes that conclusion, that religion is false because science is true. So for him, science being true negates religion being true. Like they're opposites. Religion and science cannot be true. That's in Adrian's mind, right? And that is why we said we have to first make sure we have sound reasoning in the evidence that we're analyzing, right? That reasoning is flawed, right? Science does not mean religion is false. Why does it have to mean religion is false, right? But it's a deeper issue. There's a lot more to that that we can talk about. I don't want to get into it right now. If you do have a question about it, feel free to ask, and we can talk about it, inshallah, as we progress. We will learn in this that Adrian is correct to look for evidence, but he is mistaken in his conclusions because he doesn't use the evidence properly. Here's a table that illustrates the difference between fact and preference. Matters of fact, it is raining outside today. Matter of preference, I like or I don't like rainy weather. Donald Trump was the 45th president of the USA and probably the 47th. I don't like Trump as the president of the USA, or I like, right? That's a preference. God exists, a fact. I like or don't like God exists, preference. Muhammad ﷺ is God's messenger, fact. I like or don't like Muhammad ﷺ, that's a preference. Islam is true, fact. I like or don't like Islam, preference. So preference, you use the word like or don't like, right? What you want and what you don't want. What it means for Islam to be true. This is a long chapter. Okay, let me try to read through this quickly. So what about Islam? Does Islam return to evidence or merely faith? The existence of God and the genuineness of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's claim to be God's messenger are sometimes presented as matters of preference rather than as matters of fact. Whenever we say that we believe in God and worship Him because it is a part of our culture, we are presenting our belief in Him as a matter of preference. And when we do that, we are saying that our religious beliefs are subjective and cannot be proven true. Right, so a lot of Muslims are Muslims because they were raised Muslim. That is how they grew up. So they're like, I'm Muslim because I was born Muslim. That's it. And that is incorrect. A Muslim should not be Muslim just because they were born into it. A Muslim's faith has to be based on sound proof and evidence. Is that clear? Our scholars have even debated. They said, is the iman of a blind follower valid? To this extent. So they say if a person is Muslim just because they were born into Islam, and they're like, I'm Muslim because I was just born into it. And that's the only reason I'm Muslim. The scholars debate, is this person's iman valid in the sight of God? Because he believes in God just because it's a preference. It's not based on hujjah. It's not based on proof. Right? And this is the dispute. All of this to show what? That our belief in God as Muslims requires us, it prefers for us. It requires us to be Muslims based on sound reason and evidence, not just based on culture or because we were born into it. Contrary to the case of most Muslims, right? They're just born into it and it's a preference. And so may Allah grant us understanding and sound knowledge, right? Ameen ya Rabbi. He says, now he explains why do people do this. He says, we might do this because we were born into Muslim families and Islamic cultures and have never explored the objective reasons why we are Muslim. We might not be aware that the evidence-based belief in Islam is the central message of the Quran. Islam is an evidence-based religion that encourages you to think and ask questions. And this is contrary to any other religion, right? You see that. Why do you believe? We believe because we're supposed to believe. No, Islam doesn't want you to do that. Islam wants you to ask the questions. Why do we believe in this? Ask. Figure it out. Ask the questions. Gain the evidence. Make sure it makes sense to you and that you're not just doing it because you're being told to do. Does that make sense? Okay. We can see this plainly in the Quran. When Abraham addresses, so there's a typo there, you can correct that. When Abraham addresses the ancient Arabians, it speaks of Islam and the Quran as being a clear truth. When the Quran addresses, I don't think it's Abraham, I correct that. When the Quran addresses the ancient Arabians, it speaks of Islam and the Quran as being a clear truth that they can see for themselves. It is this religion, this religion is the truth from your Lord, so do not be of those who waver. Al-haqqu min rabbik fala takunanna min al-mumtarin. Right? This is the ayah. This is a true religion from God. Do not be among those who waver. The truth was something that the ancient Arabians recognized based on evidence. The mission of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was to explain that evidence to help each of us come to our own independent realization that Islam is in fact true. The ancient Arabian polytheists recognized this. The polytheists are the mushriks, those who associated gods with Allah Ta'ala, who worship multiple deities. The Jewish and Christian tribes of the Arabian Peninsula also recognized this. When the early Christians, listened to which has been revealed to the messenger, you see their eyes overflow with tears because they recognize the truth. The evidence that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam brought, the evidence that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam brought was so clear that the ancient Arabians had no response. All they could do was reject Islam and cling to the ways of the ancestors based on mere preference, even though clear evidence proved that Islam was a true fact. This is why there are so many verses in the Quran that censure the ancient Arabians for following the ways of their ancestors without evidence, without any evidence. I want you guys to pay attention to this paragraph here, and it's talking about human psychology. When human beings are defeated with truth and they're arrogant, then they cling onto other excuses for not following the truth. We make excuses up. We generally do that, right? So let's say you're making an argument about something and somebody else is making a counter argument and they're right. And imagine them being right like disproves the values and norms of your society. It's difficult to embrace that. So what happens? You're like, oh no, we don't want to follow this. We're just going to follow the way of our ancestors. Does that make sense? Ego gets in the way of that, right? Ego gets in the way. And so that's kind of human nature, that when we feel corrected, we automatically go into this defense mode where we reject the truth because of our ego, our pride. We feel we are being threatened. So therefore, it becomes hard to humble ourselves and to be like, oh, you're right. Like, I made a mistake, right? Like, I didn't consider that. Or, you know, like, this is true. Like, I accept it, right? And so the Arabians, ancient Arabians were very arrogant and stubborn. And so when the Prophet ﷺ overwhelmed them with miracles and proofs, they would find a reason to disbelieve in him. They would say, we won't believe in you until you bring the angels down from the sky, or you split the heavens open, or you create rivers from the earth. Right? وَقَالُوا لَن نُؤْمِنَ لَكَ حَتَّى تَفْجُرَ لَنَا مِنَ الْأَرْضِ يَنْبُوعًا. Right? They were asking for all these like miracles, like we want this, or and he would say, and they would say, what? You know, Allah says, وَإِن يَرَوْا كُلَّ آيَةٍ لَا يُؤْمِنُوا بِهَا. Like if they were granted every ayah, they would still not believe. Because you're pouring knowledge on a brick. No matter how much proofs you pour, right? If you have a sponge and you pour water on a sponge, it will absorb it because it's going to absorb it. It's the nature of a sponge. But if you have somebody whose mind is a brick, they've made up their mind, you can pour as much reason and evidence you want on that person all day. You can try to persuade them, convince them, use ration, whatever. They've made up their mind. No matter how much truth you present to them, you cannot convince them because their mind has been set. And it's part of wisdom to know when a person has set their mind so you don't waste time arguing with them. Right? When you know a person's mind is set, like, I'm not even going to waste my time arguing with you because I already know you have made up your mind. So what's the point? Right? Social media is kind of like, I never get into social media debates. Right? Because I'm like, people have made up their minds. You're not going to get anywhere debating anybody. I've never seen somebody change their position because of a social media debate. People have made up their minds. And especially on a computer. You're not persuading anybody. Right? So I'm just like, okay, I'm not ever going to debate a person online because there's no point. Right? So this is just human nature. When a person has made up their mind, they're set in stone. You know whatever you're saying, they're not listening to understand. They're listening to react, to counter-argue whatever you're saying. It's not even like, oh, you make sense. No. Okay, I got a counter-argument. Okay, here's my counter. Like, you know it's not going anywhere. At that point, it's like, what? Salamun alaykum la nabtaghil jahilin. Is it like, peace upon you? You know, we don't want to get into ignorance, right? What's the point? What's the point of arguing with you? Because we're just going to get frustrated and angry with each other. So we might as well just stop at this point and move on with our conversation or with our lives, right? And so that's just something to be mindful of when it comes to da'wah and just persuasion and arguments and so on. Here he says he shares another verse of the Quran. When it is said to them, the ancient Arabians, come to what God has revealed and to the messenger, they say, what we found our ancestors doing is enough for us. Will they cling to the ways of their ancestors, even though they had no evidence-based knowledge whatsoever and were not guided? Right? This is how the mushrikeen responded. 2 more pages, or 2.5 more pages roughly. The goal of this book is to learn the evidence for Islam's truth, so that our Islam changes from being a cultural preference to an objective and evidence-based fact. That will allow us to choose to be Muslim because we really believe that it's true, rather than being Muslim just because we are born into Muslim families. As you learn this evidence, don't hesitate to ask questions. I have to emphasize that. Please ask questions. And even to object to the evidence that is presented to you. Yes, please challenge the theories and concepts, right? Because that is when you are really understanding. When you can ask questions and be like, hey, this doesn't make sense. Why? Right? Or here's something I'm noticing. How do you explain this? Like, ask those questions, right? This is the point of our class. I want it to be like a really critical, where we apply critical thinking. And we're asking the hard questions. This is the purpose of this class. And so the process of asking questions and considering objections will help you understand the evidence and strengthen your conviction, because you will come to see for yourself that Islamic beliefs are objectively true and that they can be objectively proven to be true with evidence. Here he has a little illustration for those of us who have the book. The definition of Islam. My dad says atoms are liars. They make up everything. They make up everything. Do you guys get the joke? Everything is made up of atoms. Right? Everything is made up of atoms. So he says atoms are liars. They make up everything. All right. Anyways, that's just a joke there. All right, we can move on. Are atoms, but he shares this example, right? Are atoms really liars? As the teenager in the cartoon is claiming, it depends on what the phrase "they make up everything" means. If the phrase means they lie, then yes, atoms are liars. But if the phrase means they constitute everything, as the physics teacher sitting at the desk claims, then no, atoms aren't liars. The teenager and the physics teacher are understanding different meanings from the phrase "make up everything," and that is leading to confusion and some humor, right? And this just shows us, subhanAllah, right, the importance of perspective. Right? When you say they make up everything, what does the student mean? What does the teacher mean? Right? The teacher means they make up everything, meaning everything, all material is made up of atoms. So for him, it's no, it's true. The kid is thinking metaphorically. So he's no, they make everything like they're lying, right? So sometimes it's important to have that. People who know how to communicate well know how to get through these different perspectives. And I'm just going to share a side note. I work as a therapist, and I work a lot on communication, relationships, in marriage, in business, in families. And a lot of times is that people's perspectives are just different, and they're having a hard time understanding each other's perspective. There's a disconnect. And then that leads to frustration, and it leads to a standoff, where now you feel like you're opponents, right? And so a lot of this can be solved by what? Just learning to really understand the other person. Is this what you're saying? Can you elaborate? Can you clarify? What do you mean? That little much of asking those questions or and prompting further details from the other person, will help you understand them better, and the other person will be relieved. You finally understand me, right? This is what I've been saying the whole time, but you don't understand, right? And so, subhanAllah, it's surprising how much of a problem this lack of communication skills is in the lives of people, and how it leads to so much frustration and fighting and arguments just because they're not able to work through their perspectives in a healthy, communicative way. So that's just a side note to be mindful of. Sometimes we can have different perspectives and understand each other very different, and good communication can bridge that gap. All right, so continuing with this illustration here. The cartoon is meant to be humorous, but it is a good illustration of an important rule of good logic. Words can mean different things to different people. If the meaning of these words isn't clearly defined, then using those words can lead to confusion and miscommunication. Effective communication requires that whenever we are engaged in an important issue, discussion or debate, we need to carefully define the words that we use. And if there are phrases, we got to define the phrases that we use. And he just said what I was saying, and that is true of the word Islam. Some of us might use the word in a way that does not correspond it does not correspond with the way that we will use it in this book. Remember, the goal of this book is to explain the reasons why Islam is true. If we don't have a common understanding of what we mean by the word Islam in the statement Islam is true, then we won't understand each other, and we will talk past each other, which will be like the teenager and the physics teacher in the cartoon. That is why it is important for us to begin by clearly defining what we mean by Islam in this book. The word Islam here refers to the belief that God created us and everything else. 2, He sent a man named Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to tell us that the purpose of our creation is to worship and obey God. And C, God will resurrect us after we die and bring us to judgment. He's saying, when I say Islam is true, he's saying these 3 facts are true. Right? And by believing in these 3 facts, everything else is entailed in them. All of this is provable reality. It is not a cultural identity or a system of rituals inherited from one's Muslim family, but a description of the way things really are. Once we see that Islam is objectively true, we will also see that it is beautiful. Right? And that is what brings us to Islam. It's really beautiful. Islam offers the most compelling, intuitive, realistic, practical, fair, holistic solution and meaning for the purpose of life. Nothing comes close. Nothing really comes close to Islam. Islam will then become both a fact and a personal preference for us to see that Islam is true with our minds, and to love its being true with our hearts is our ultimate goal. Revolutionize your faith. This should excite you because your beliefs are objectively true facts. They will never contradict sound rational thinking. Right? We should all be excited, right? Because there are over 1,000 religions in the world. And for us to be on the religion that is completely makes sense and completely is in line with sound reason, I mean, there's no greater blessing, right? And this is the truth that Islam has, right? And we should be grateful as Muslims that Allah has guided us to that, either by being born in Muslim families and then being in an Islamic environment where we can learn these evidences, or by converting to Islam and Allah bringing our hearts to Islam. And I know people have different journeys. SubhanAllah, like, you know, one of our students, she shared that, like, I heard the adhan while traveling in a Muslim country, and it just it really just touched something that I've never felt before, right? It was so meaningful, it was so deep, it was so intuitive. I just felt that this is real, right? It isn't just a phase or a feeling, but this is really real, right? And that is what brings people to Islam. But more than the feeling, it rationally makes sense, and that is what we are exploring right now. It will be most importantly, you accept Islam. Acceptance of Islam will be yours. It will be a decision that you came to on your own through your own logical reasoning and sincere inquiry into truth. The idea that a set of religious beliefs is factual, that it can be proven through evidence, may be new to you. It is a common misunderstanding that faith is something subjective that cannot be proven true. In the remainder of this book, you will learn that while this idea might be true with respect to other religions, it isn't true with respect to Islam. As you work through the lessons that follow, you will gain a deep and structured understanding of the Islamic beliefs that are clearly derived from the Quran and Sunnah. You will apply what you learn to an analysis of modern science and modern atheist arguments, and you will learn that Islam never conflicts. This is very important, right? Islam never conflicts with science, nor does it ever conflict with reason. Instead, religious beliefs, scientific beliefs, and rational beliefs all complement one another to tell us about God, the universe, and the purpose of our life on earth. That is the end of chapter 1. We can take some questions and then take a short break and then resume with chapter 2 afterwards, inshallah. Any questions about chapter 1? Any phrases that really grabbed your attention? I got 2 comments or messages in the chat. I'm going to check them out. Oh, okay. So that's Shakira. She's just letting us know. Assalamu alaikum salam, Shakira. Right. Any other questions about what we have read? How do you all feel? Straightforward?
Introductory, yeah.
Introductory, pretty straightforward.
Wait, can you tell me what's the meaning of Islam to be true?
We spoke about this. I think you arrived a little late, right? So just to summarize, Islam being true, what it means is that Islam can be proven true objectively. Like Islam is a truth that if anybody was to look at it with sound mind, you will see that this is a religion of God. It cannot be made up. Does that make sense? It isn't a culture. It isn't something that I just like. That it isn't my preference, like my favorite meal or my favorite clothes or the culture of my family. No, this is something that if I looked at it objectively, it is something that I can say, yes, this is true. There's evidence to support it, that Islam is a message from God, that God created us all, that Muhammad ﷺ is a messenger of God, and that God created us with a purpose in this world. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. We continue with chapter 2. The main takeaway, the chapter 2 fact on the bottom of the page, the author, Hafidhahullah Ta'ala, he says, chapter 2 fact, the God who is described in the Quran is the necessary being who has volitional agency and is characterized by attributes of speech, hearing, and sight. That is kind of the takeaway. We're going to define what volition and agency mean, and what we mean by the phrase necessary being. Inshallah. All right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This is a bit long. Yeah, this chapter is a bit long. Okay. The difference between a God and the God. Ancient Egyptians and Mesoamericans used to worship the sun. Ancient Mesopotamians used to worship the stars. Ancient Chinese used to worship the spirits of their ancestors. And the ancient Greeks used to worship a god called Zeus, who ruled the skies, was responsible for the weather, particularly thunder and lightning, which were thought to be his weapons. Looked like a human with a beard and didn't get along well with his wife Hera. When we say, and subhanAllah, if you look at the different religions of the world, it's kind of very similar. You kind of see that idea, and that there is God for different kingdoms. The sea, the earth, the afterlife, just love, fertility. But yes, let's move on. When we say there is no God except Allah, we are saying that none of these things, not the sun, not the stars, not the spirits of our ancestors, and certainly not in imaginary superhumans that fly in the sky, are God, and that only Allah is God. When the word Allah, linguistically in Arabic, our scholars have discussed this much, and the predominant opinion is that the word Allah is derived from the root word of ilah, which means al-ilah, and so the alif was dropped, the hamza, ilah, so instead of saying al-ilah, it became just Allah. They removed the e and it became Allah, which means the God, right? The God, the one and only God. And so it is the phrase that is used to title God. And another question that has come up among our scholars is the name Allah the universal name of God, or is it the name of God in Arabic? And so a lot of our scholars, they go to the position that Allah is the name of God in Arabic. So in Arabic, the name of God is Allah, and that there could be other phrases in other religions that is similar to that. And some scholars adopt the position that Allah is the universal name of God in all religions, in all, in all customs, languages, and so on and so forth. But that's the name. We call it Lafdul Jalala, the magnificent name. And so it's the name of Allah. And so, Ta'ala. When an atheist says that he doesn't believe in God, what kind of God is he imagining? Is he imagining the gods of the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Mesopotamians, the ancient Chinese, or the ancient Greeks? Is he imagining the God of Islam? If he is imagining the gods of the ancient Egyptians, ancient Mesopotamians, the ancient Chinese, or the ancient Greeks, then we agree with him. We don't believe in those gods either, because there's no evidence for their existence. But if he is imagining the God of Islam, then we disagree with him. The God of Islam does in fact exist because we have clear evidence for his existence. Before we begin examining the evidence for the existence of God of the God of Islam, let's look at some important Quranic verses to understand exactly who he is and how he is different from all other gods that some ancient civilizations have believed in. Right? So, in essence, is how do we as Muslims define God? Right? What is God to the Muslim versus what is God to other people? Right? Other people, as you can see in all these ancient religions, God is some type of being that's connected to our world. Be it a superhuman, be it the spirits of ancestors, be it the spirits of animals, and right, like in Native American, a lot of Native American religions, be it Mesopotamian, they worship the sun, be it the worship of the fire, and Zoroastrians, like God was always defined as this being of the world, right? Some type of creature of the world. And Muslims are like, no, the world is created, God is divine, uncreated. Right? He's beyond creation, right? So there's a clear difference between the Islam's definition of God and the definition of all of these ancient religions. And this idea of and that's why we say subhanallah, right? Because what people always do is they degrade God to be some type of creature of this world. And we're like, subhanallah, God is beyond this world. He created this world, so how can you say he is like a creature of this world? Does that make sense? So we say subhanallah, right? Like Allah is above this imperfection that they associate to him. And Christians did the same once Paul came and they claimed the Trinity, that God has a son and that his son is 3 in 1. Again, they reduced God to being part of mortal creation. It's like Isa alayhi salam, or spirit like the angel Jibreel alayhi salam, and that God is somewhat 1/3 of the 3 parts. And now they've reduced God to being part of his creation. Does that make sense? He's part of the creatures that he made now. And Muslims are like, subhanallah, this is Allah's creation. Allah is above the creation. You can't compare God to the creation he made. Is that clear? So there's a clear definition on how Muslims define God and how other religions have defined God. What does the Quran tell us? Here he says what the Quran tells us about God. The Quran tells us 13 simple facts about God that are well known to every Muslim. These simple facts can be broadly grouped in the following 4 statements. Number 1, God exists, but not in the same way that we exist. And we're going to talk about that, because God exists, but not in the same way we exist, because we exist by what? We were created. We exist based on a timeline. God's existence is outside of time. Time is a creation of God. We take up space, time, and matter, right? God is beyond space, time, and matter. So he is unlike his creation. That is one of the principles of the Quran. That's what the Quran says. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ كُفُوًا أَحَدٍ. There's no equal to God. There's no comparison that you can make to God. All of this is His creation. Number 2, God is characterized by 5 privative attributes. Privative means like they negate other qualities. Is that clear? And we're going to talk about that, inshallah. But you'll learn more about these attributes below, what privative means. Number 4, God is a volitional agent. You will learn what this means below as well. And number 4, God hears, sees, and speaks without resembling human beings. We will now examine each of the 13 facts. We will learn what they mean in some of the Quranic verses that mention them. We're just right now, yes, you have a question?
Yeah, you keep stating like the pronoun he for God, but why he? Why don't you say the God Allah?
No. So the brother asked, and this is a common question, why do we use the pronoun he to describe God, as I'm using, right? He, God. Why don't we just say, what did you recommend? What was the alternative?
Or like saying the God or Allah.
The God or Allah, right? Pronouns are a form of speech that we use to communicate in all languages, right? Because we don't always use names. We don't always use the noun. We use the pronoun as an alternative. And so we use it because it's a form of communication, not... so that's one. It's a form of communication. It exists in all languages. Instead of saying, I'm talking about, let's say, I'm talking about you, Hamza, right? And I'm like, well, Hamza is in class. Hamza is writing. Hamza is reading, right? It's kind of annoying, right? Like, why are you saying his name every single time? Like, you already said his name once. Just like, say, like, Hamza is in class and he's reading and he's writing and he's doing his work, right? So we use pronouns as a form of communication to simplify communication so we don't have to repeat name, every time we're describing a person, right? And imagine we're talking about 5 people, right? Hamza, Saeed, and Samba, and Abdul Rashid, and Abdul Qadir are all in class. And now I say, and Hamza, Saeed, and Samba, and Abdul Rashid, and Abdul Qadir are all doing their work. And then I say all their names again. It's exhausting. So what do we say? They. It makes communication easy. It saves me from saying all those. And I imagine we have 100 people, right? Well, that's going to take up all day, right? Every time you want to say a sentence about a group of 100 people, you're never going to end. So pronouns are a form of communication. And the languages have developed pronouns, differently. In English, right, it's he, she, they, right? He, she, him, they, her, right? Us, so on and so forth. Arabic has 12 pronouns, right? Huwa, hiya, and then you have the, mukhatab, and then you have, 5 of the mukhatab and 5 of the ghaib. There are like 5 pronouns for the people you talk to. You, that's masculine. You, that's feminine. You two, and then you all, that's masculine, and you all, that's feminine. So 5 pronouns and another 5. So languages have developed different pronouns, and so it's a form of communication that generally languages all share. So why do we use he? Why don't we use she or they or them or any other pronoun? And this is based on the Arabic language. The default pronoun in Arabic language is he, which is huwa. That's the default pronoun. Whenever you describe an object in Arabic language, the pronoun you use is what? Huwa. And then hiya, if it's feminine, but by default you use huwa. And so that's one. And so it is by no way to say that God is what? Masculine or feminine. No. Because masculinity and femininity is a quality of creation. And God is above what? His creation, subhanAllah. So this idea of sex and gender don't apply to God. These are concepts He created. Does that make sense? So He's above His creation. Does that make sense? Right? So when we say He, God, it's a form of speech. It has nothing to do with gender identity or sexual identity or anything of that sort that we would use for human beings. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? All right. And then the other point that I would add is that the other pronoun that the Quran uses is us or we. Nahnu. So the Quran uses inna and nahnu, which means us or we. And the Quran also uses I. Allah uses I, inni and Allah. For example, Allah says, indeed, I am Allah. So He uses I. And he uses huwa, which is huwa Allahu, qul huwa Allahu ahad huwa, which means he or him. And then the third pronoun Allah uses is us or we. Inna nahnu nazzalna alayka al-Qur'ana tanzila. Indeed, we are the ones that revealed the Qur'an to you, right? And so Allah uses these three pronouns. And each one has a benefit, right? I is that Allah Ta'ala is speaking as the first person. When he uses he, huwa, he's describing himself as a third person. Say he is Allah. Does that make sense? So he's describing himself as a third person. And when he says I, he's describing himself as the first person. All right? And then the other one, we is used to as a pronoun used for magnificence. And also it's used for respect. When you're speaking to an individual, you say, كيف حالكم? You use the kum out of respect for the individual. I'll address you as a pronoun because of how much respect, as a plural, right? And even this also exists in English, like especially like in old English, like kings or queens would say like, we have decreed. No, the king decreed, but they say we have decreed, right? As if the king is like a plural, right? But it's an expression of power and magnificence. So those are the pronouns that is used in the Quran for Allah Ta'ala. So it all comes down to language. It's not about nothing else, with regards to qualities of creation. All right, continuing. Any other questions? No, all right. We will now examine each of the 13 facts. Each of the 13 facts, we will learn what they mean in some of the Quranic verses that mention them. Adnan mentions very nicely. Thank you, Adnan. Jazakallah khair. He says, we is known as a royal we. Right? It actually, there's a term, that, right? It's called the royal we. Right? So this is like royalty. When you want to describe royalty, you use the phrase we. So continuing, we will now examine each of the 13 facts. We will learn what they mean in some of the Quranic verses that mention them. Fact 1, God exists necessarily. So first thing, God exists what? Necessarily. All right, and we're going to comment on that a bit more later. I'm going to read the verse right now and then I'll read his commentary. Allah Ta'ala says, do you know that He alone controls everything, like the translation of the verse. Do you know that He alone controls everything in the heavens and everything in the earth, and that nothing else controls Him? And so Allah Ta'ala is the one that controls everything in the heavens and the earth, and that nothing controls Him. Another verse, Allah, there is no God but He, the ever-living and the eternal sustainer. Allahu la ilaha illahu al-hayyul qayyum. The beginning of Ayat al-Kursi. That's the ayah. Ayah 107 of Surah Al-Baqarah, I'm having a hard time recalling it. أَلَمْ تَعْلَمْ أَنَّ اللَّهَ لَهُ مُلْكُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. Right? I believe that's the verse in Surah Al-Baqarah. Do you not know that He alone controls everything in the heavens and everything in the earth? So he says here, continuing his explanation, God exists, but His existence is different from the existence of everything else. God exists everything besides God needs Him to make it exist. They are all dependent, right? All of creation is what? Dependent. And that is why Allah says, you're fuqara. Fuqara means to be what? Dependent. We're all fuqara to God. We're all in need. We're all poor. We're all dependent on God. We're all fuqara. Or iyal. Kullukum iyalullah. Right? Iyal also means kids, but iyal linguistically is someone that depends on another. Right? And so we're all na'ul ilallah, right? We all depend on Allah Ta'ala. Everything is dependent. And so God, everything beside God needs Him to make it exist. This is the kind of existence that you have, that the sun has, the lightning has, that everything else that you can touch or feel has. All of these things need something to make them exist. We call this contingent existence. Is that clear? Right? They can't exist without a maker, without a doer, without a creator. So we all have what? Contingent existence. He says afterwards, God's existence is different because He doesn't need anyone to make Him exist. He does not exist contingently. We call His existence necessary existence. Another way of saying this is to say that it is not possible for him to not exist. It is not possible for God to not exist. Another way of saying he's a necessary being. Meaning that God always exists and will always exist. There is never God without any existence. Subhanahu wa ta'ala. We will get more to this inshallah later. Because the question will come up, right? God's existence without a beginning. How do we rationalize that? And I guess I can answer it now, but I think it's too premature. I would like to save the answer for later, if you guys are okay with that. Yeah, we'll save this for later, inshallah. All right. He says, you will learn more about why the one who made everything in the universe must necessarily exist in chapter 2. So we will save that for later, inshallah. I think we are in chapter 2. Okay, it should be chapter 3. That's a typo, correct that. The distinction between contingent existence and necessary existence is a key idea that we will return to again and again throughout this book. The next 5 facts 2 to 6 about God are called privative attributes. An attribute is privative when it denotes the absence of something, right? So highlight that. What does it mean for a privative attribute? It denotes the absence of something. These five attributes negate 5 important imperfections from God. Another way of saying this is that they tell us what God is not rather than what He is. These are privative attributes, right? They're telling us what He's not. And so number 1, or fact 2, God is beginningless. He is the first and the last. He is huwa al-awwal wal-akhir. He was not begotten. وَلَمْ يَلِدْ وَلَمْ يُولَدْ. He is not begotten. وَلَمْ يُولَدْ. This means that God's existence is not preceded by non-existence. Another way of saying this is that Another way of saying this is that God did not begin to exist, right? I think that's the more. It's supposed to be did not begin to exist. There's a lot of typos, unfortunately. If somebody could keep really like mark your books and then later on, I don't have a pen, we can send it to the publisher and be like, hey, these are all the typos we found in the book. Yet another way of saying this is that God does not need anything to make Him exist. This is a privative attribute because it negates the defect that God began to exist. Fact 3, God is endless. Place your trust in the ever-living who will never die. Allah also, in the other verse, He is the first and the last. This means that God's existence is not followed by non-existence. Another way of saying this is that God's existence does not end. This is a privative attribute because it negates the defect that God will stop existing. Is that clear? How these are privative? All right, we'll continue inshallah and then we'll take questions at the end. Number 4, fact 4, God is independent. He is the everlasting refuge. Allahu Samad. Verily Allah is completely free of need from anything else. This means that God doesn't need anything. This is a privative attribute because it negates the defect that God depends on anything else. Fact 5, God is transcendent. This is very important to understand. There is absolutely nothing like Him. There is absolutely nothing like Him. No one resembles Him. I want to elaborate on this. No one resembles God. There is nothing like God. As human beings, we define things by what we know, what we experience, right? Let me elaborate. We know everything is based on time, correct? Objects take up space, correct? Objects are made up of matter, correct? Objects have color. Oh, you got me on the Zoom? Oh, yeah, that is. Okay. You know, when I just a side note, okay, we have a serious topic. Let's focus. Okay, no worries. It's okay. Take your time.
Thank you. Say something?
We're okay? Okay, I think we're okay. All right, so we said God is transcendent, right? And what I was saying, right, that us as human beings, we define things based on experience. We can't define or comprehend something we've never experienced. Is that clear? right? Like everything, like even when you look at movies and creativity, it's just a slight modification of things we have in our world, right? We can't create something that is completely original. A living being that's not made up of matter, space, and time. We can't process that because all living things are made up of space, matter, and time. So how do you have a living being that's not made of space, matter, and time? We can't comprehend that. It's beyond everything we know and have experienced. Does that make sense? Are you guys? Is this concept clear? And so God is transcendent. He's beyond this, and that's why the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Do not think about the essence of God. Think about the signs of God." Right? Because you can see, لا تتفكروا في ذات الله وتفكروا في آلاء الله. The essence of God, the reality of God is unlike everything we know. So how can you fathom it? For a simpler version, our own soul. We don't even know how life works and what a soul is. Is it a changeable thing? Does it have weight? Does it have a color? Does it have a shape? How does it work? Where does it go after we don't know. What is this spirit? What is this world? We don't understand the complexities of our own selves. How can we begin to fathom the complexity of God's reality? Does that make sense? And so that is why the hadith, like, don't think about the reality of God because you can never understand it. You can never comprehend it, right? If you think about what is the greatest world that exists, your imagination. The greatest world that exists is what? Your imagination. Your mind cannot imagine something that you've never ever experienced. Completely original. What your mind can do is manipulate what you've experienced and try to create new forms of what you have experienced, but it can't create something completely original. Does that make sense? Right? So God is transcendent. We can never, He is beyond His creation, subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so remember that hadith as a principle that you can't comprehend the essence of God, but you can comprehend the signs of God. You can look at the evidence and be like, I see the mark. You know, one of the poets was asked, like, how do you know God? He said, what did he say? Like, he said, the footprint of the traveler tells me there was a person that traveled here. Right? Atharul Masir. Brother Saeed, do you know the phrase? I forgot the phrase, like you know the footprint, like a traveler based on the tracks, like Atharul Masir subhanallah, I forgot. There's a phrase that like a Bedouin use, like, you know, a very simple man. But he's like, when I see like the tracks of a traveler, I know there's a traveler here. And how can I not look at the springs and look at the rivers and look at the stars and not know that there's a creator that made them? Right? The signs are there. Like, I don't have to see the creator because I see all of the signs of the creator. Just like I don't have to see the traveler to know there was a traveler here because I see all of the footprints of the traveler. I see the prints of his animal that walked here, so I know there's a traveler here, right? And so he's like, how can I not? Like, everything screams Allah. Does that make sense? Right? So Allah is evident. He's self-evident. Everything in the world says there's a creator. How can I not believe in that? How can I deny that? It would be insanity. Is that clear? Make sense? Okay. We got a bit sidetracked with this topic, but just clarifying, God is transcendent. There's absolutely nothing like Him. No one resembles Him. This means that God does not resemble anything else. This is a privative quality, right? Remember that everything apart from God is contingent and needs Him to exist. If He resembles anything else, He would be contingent too. This is a privative attribute because it negates God's resemblance to anything else, which is a defect. Because if it were true, it would mean that He needs something else to make Him exist. I think, is that clear? Is there any questions about that? It's okay. We can move on. We'll kind of go over this again and again as we read, inshallah ta'ala. We want to just wrap this up for the sake of time. Fact 6, God is one. Know that there is no God but Allah. Say that the great matter is that Allah is utterly one. قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ فَاعْلَمْ أَنَّهُ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهُ. This means that there is no other God. It is a privative attribute because it negates the defect of God sharing His Godhood with anyone else. Right? When we say God is one, it negates that God shares His Godhood with anyone else. We call this Tawheed al-Ilahiyya or Tawheed al-Uluhiyya, that God is one, right? Or al-Rububiyyah as well, Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. And that's what Tawheed means, right? You will learn more about why the existence of more than one God is a defect in chapter 8. The next 4 facts about God describe His volitional agency. A volitional agent is someone who freely chooses his actions. For God to be a volitional agent means that He freely chose to make everything in the universe the way that it is. Another way of saying this is that, is to state that it is possible for Him to have made the universe differently. Right? He chose it to make it, and He chose to make it the way that it is. He could have made it differently, or He could have not created it at all. The opposite of a volitional agent is a non-volitional cause. Some people believe that God is a non-volitional cause like a machine. According to these people, God didn't freely choose to make the universe the way that it is. Rather, He had to make the universe the way that it is, and it couldn't have been otherwise. You will learn more about the difference between actions and causes in chapter 5. Number 7, God is alive. Allah, there is no God but Him, the ever-living and the eternal sustainer. God's life is an aspect of His volitional agency. Someone who is not alive cannot be a volitional agent. God's life does not resemble our life, nor does it resemble the life of any other animal. Our life and the life of animals depend on oxygen, water, and food. God's life does not depend on anything. Our life is created by Him. His life is necessary, beginningless, and endless. That is why He will always be alive. Again, we're just going through the Quran's description of God, and so every Muslim should know the names of Allah and His attributes, and we know all of this intuitively for the most part. Fact 8, God has knowledge. God intimately knows everything. He has complete knowledge of all things. And we know that one of Allah's names is Al-Alim, right? And Allah describes His knowledge in various verses. He's Khabir, Alim, Basir, Muhit, right? All of this means what? He's all-knowing, all-aware, all-comprehending, right? And so Allah knows all things. God's knowledge is another aspect of His volitional agency. Someone who does not have knowledge cannot choose to do anything. That is why if God did not have knowledge, He would not be a volitional agent, right? Knowledge is a requirement of choice. Because you have to know what is possible to even make a choice. So knowledge is a quality of God that the Quran describes, and it is part of His volitional agency. God's knowledge does not resemble our knowledge. Our knowledge depends on learning, thinking, and reasoning. God's knowledge doesn't depend on anything. He simply knows. Our knowledge is limited. God knows everything. Our knowledge is created by Him. His knowledge is necessary, beginningless, and endless. Fact 9, God has volition. Surely Allah does whatever He wills. Your Lord creates whatever He wills. These are verses of the Quran. Continuing, the author's comment. God's volition is the most important aspect of His volitional agency. For God to have volition means that He freely chooses to do everything that He does. He freely chose to create us. That means He could not have created us at all. It also means that He could have created us differently. The same with the birds. He freely chose to create them. He could have not created them at all, and He could have created them differently, and so on. God's volition does not resemble our volition. Our volition is limited because our knowledge is limited. We cannot choose to do something that we do not know, right? That is why our volition is limited. And because our power is limited, we cannot choose to do something that we are unable to do. God can choose to do anything. Our volition is created by Him. His volition is necessary, beginningless, and endless. Fact 10, God is powerful. We're almost at the end, just a page and a half to go, or 2 pages to go. God is powerful. God is completely able to do everything. God is gentle and kind to His servants. He provides whoever He will. He provides for whoever He will. He is the powerful, the Almighty. Again, these are 2 verses of Quran. Here he describes the author, rahimahullah, or jazakallahu khairan, God's power is an aspect of his volitional agency. For God to have power means that he can make things exist or make them not exist. If he didn't have power, he wouldn't be a volitional agent because he wouldn't be able to do anything. God's power does not resemble our power. Our power is limited because we are weak. God's power is unlimited. He can do anything. Our power is created by him. His power is necessary, beginningless, and endless. All of the 10 facts mentioned above are repeated throughout the Quran, but we don't need to rely on the Quran to prove that they are true. We can prove them true by just using our minds. In fact, again, right, I said all of this is intuitive. We know all of this about God, and the Quran elaborates and gives us the revelation to confirm that. In fact, the Quran teaches us just to do that. It teaches us to learn the truth of these facts based on evidence, not to simply accept them as true because they are mentioned in the Quran. In the following chapters, we will learn the evidence for the existence of God and for the fact that he is characterized by all the facts that have been mentioned above. The God whose existence we will prove is the one who is characterized by these 10 facts. The next 3 facts, on the other hand, cannot be proven true without relying on the Quran. So there is intuitive knowledge about God, rational, and there is revelatory where we cannot know. We need wahi to tell us these attributes about God. Does that make sense? Are you guys with me? So God hearing, seeing, and speaking. God knows, but how do we know that God speaks, hears, and sees? Because he told us. He said he speaks, so therefore we believe he speaks. He said he hears, so therefore we believe he hears. We cannot come to that fact on a rational conclusion. Is that clear?
So is that wahi or revelation?
That's wahi. Revelation is wahi. Revelation has to give us that knowledge. Is that clear? However, that does not mean there is no evidence for their truth. Since we have evidence that the Quran is genuinely from God, we will be learning this evidence in chapter 12 to 17. Whenever we believe in something that the Quran tells us, we are believing in it based on evidence. And so here are the 3 facts that are based on revelation, based on wahi. Fact 11, God speaks. Allah spoke to Musa directly. وَكَلَّمَ اللَّهُ مُوسَى تَكْلِيمًا. God's being characterized by the attribute of speech means that he commanded us to pray, for example, forbid us from committing adultery, for example, and informs us about paradise and hell, for example. God's speech does not resemble our speech. Unlike our speech, it does not require any body parts or organs, nor does it consist of sounds. It doesn't begin, it doesn't end, and it doesn't have any grammatical syntax or order. Our speech is created by him. His speech is necessary, beginningless, endless. We don't hear his speech, cannot imagine what it is like, but we are informed of what he says through the messengers that he sends us. So again, right, you have to remember, whenever you describe any of Allah's names, you have to describe it with transcendence. So if God speaks, he doesn't speak like us. There isn't sound and beginning and an end and syntax and vocabulary. None of this applies to God. God speaks in a way that befits him. The reality of that, we don't know. Is that clear? That's simple. That is the principle. Right? Is that clear? Make sense? We can't comprehend the essence of God's speech.
Could he possibly speak through you, through your body, like through your words?
No, God doesn't. That's not God speaking. That's not.
But like something, well, not, I shouldn't say speak.
He can inspire.
Can he inspire, like through your own voice?
God can inspire you, but yes. So you said, can God inspire through your own voice?
Your own voice, like you hear it in your thoughts. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
Like you feel it.
Mm-hmm.
Like when you're talking about the signs.
Yes.
It moves you to go a different direction.
Yes. God can inspire. God can give revelation. He can give knowledge. All of this, yes.
Okay.
But it isn't God speaking through us. It's God inspiring us with knowledge.
Gotcha. That makes more sense.
Right. وَأَوْحِينَا إِلَى أُمِّ مُوسَى نَرْضِعِيهِ أو أَنْ أَلْقِيهِ. Right. We inspired the mother of Musa to cast Moses in the river. Right. So God inspired her. There was no revelation. There was no angel.
Right.
She was given just an inspiration. She knew that there's a message divine. There's a supernatural message in her telling her to cast this child. It was an inspiration. So she cast the child.
So we can't dream
You can dream God is talking to you, but that speech is not God's speech. That is God conveying inspiration to you through the means of a speech, but that it isn't God's literal speech. Does that make sense? Yeah. It isn't literal. It isn't God's words, God speaking words to you and with sound and so on. But that knowledge is from God, and He's inspiring you to have it.
And can Shaitan play as God in your dreams?
Can Shaitan play as God in your dreams? That's a bit complex because the Shaitan cannot, that's a bit complex. But generally, yes, Shaitan can say, I'm God. But he's not God. He's a fool. He's a devil, right? And anybody who has believed in God will know that he's not God. Same like the Dajjal. The Dajjal will come and he say, I'm God. And he will do supernatural things, right? The Dajjal will do some supernatural things. And he will say, I'm God. But the believer will be like, what? My Lord, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, like, he's blind and your Lord is not blind. Like, he's a human. He's contingent. He's blind. He's born. He dies. Right? Like, God is transcendent. So I know you're not God. Right? The believer will know this. Right? But a person without Iman, without Islam, God is anybody who has a supernatural power. Like Zeus. He's the new Zeus of the world. We're going to pray to him. Right? So people's understanding of God is limited or ignorant. So they might believe. A lot of people will believe in him. Right? I'm actually intending to make our khutbah this Friday about the Dajjal, interestingly. So this will, will be a matter of Shaitan can impersonate. Does that make sense? He can impersonate, but he's not God. He has no divine qualities. All right. Continuing, God hears. He is indeed all-hearing, all-knowing. God's being characterized by the attribute of hearing means that he hears everything that we say and every sound that is produced. He also knows all of these things, but his hearing is different. His hearing them is different from his knowing them, although we don't know how. So God hearing us is different than him knowing. But how does he hear? We don't know how. And how is it different? We don't know how. Right? Because hearing is a method of acquiring, of knowing. And God already knows. So what does the hearing, what purpose does the hearing serve if he already knows all things? Right? Does that make sense? So we know that God said he hears, which is different than his knowledge. But how is it different and what does that reality mean? We don't know. We just affirm that God hears. Again, we can't comprehend the essence of God, and that is why, like, we believe in the scholars. They had adopted two schools with regards to the attributes of God. Those who make ta'wil, meaning they try to reinterpret this as being metaphorical. And those who say this tafweed, like these meanings are only known, like the reality of this is known to Allah. We don't know their reality. How this works, we don't know. All we know is Allah said this and we believe in it, that he hears. How? It is unknown to us. But for sure, it's not like how we hear. It's not like how we hear sound waves in our eardrums, our brain process, right? That's creatures hearing. God's hearing is beyond, he's transcendent. Remember, this is contingent. The hearing of contingent beings, God is beyond that. We can't process the essence or the reality of God's qualities. Our hearing is created by him. His hearing is necessary, beginningless, and endless. Okay, let's move on. And the last, fact 13, God sees. Indeed, Allah is all-hearing and all-seeing. God's being characterized by the attribute of sight means that he sees everything that we do and everything else that exists, whether big or small, moving or still, high in the sky or deep in the earth. He also knows all of these things, but his seeing is different from his knowing them, although we don't know how. Unlike our sight, his sight does not require eyes. It is not diminished by distance. It is not limited by darkness. Our sight is created by him. His sight is necessary, beginningless, and endless. There's discussion questions and key terms. You guys can look over that. I would recommend, I don't want to give homework. I think you're all adults and you know your what's, but I would recommend just kind of like reflecting on the questions and just kind of think about it, just process it, verbalize, like, can I answer this question? Kind of like that, you know? You write a voice note, maybe journal a little bit, and come back with some reflection. Be like, hey, I was thinking about this, and I have a question about this. Like, I would really recommend it, but because you're adult, I don't want to make it like, like homework. Everybody, next Sunday is due, right? Midnight, or by 6 p.m., right? No, we're not. I don't want to do that, But I definitely want to encourage it, though. So journal, just kind of write and kind of see like, hey, can I like explain this to myself? Do a test. Think of it like that. Can I explain this to myself? Right? That's it. And then what questions arise, and then write down your questions. So I encourage that, but not require it. And then bring that to class, and we can discuss it, inshallah, in the beginning of our class. Alhamdulillah, we got through 2 chapters. We're 10 minutes past our time. We're not too bad. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us understanding. We ask Him to grant us sincere iman. We ask Him subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us conviction and absolute certainty in Him and His Messenger and in the last day. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to forgive us, our parents, our teachers, and all of the Muslimin. We ask Him subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us steadfastness upon His deen, to protect us from the trials and tribulations of the world. We ask Allah to illuminate our hearts, illuminate our minds, to guide our behavior, to inspire us to do good and protect us from doing evil. We ask Him to ease the affairs of all the believing men and women around the world and to grant them relief. We ask Him to descend His mercy upon us and upon all the believers, to forgive us and all the believers, those who are alive and those who have passed. Allahumma ameen wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.